On the 9th of December 1721, a committee of the House of Commons sat down in a locked room in Westminster and did something Parliament rarely did in the 18th century. It opened a company's private ledger and read names aloud. The company was the South Sea Company. The event that brought Parliament to that ledger was the collapse of a stock that had climbed from roughly £128 to over £1,000 in under 8 months, then fallen back below 150 before the year was out, wiping out fortunes across England in a matter of weeks. The standard account of what happened has calcified into something close to folklore over the last 3 centuries. Greedy investors, the story goes, lost their heads over a company that never did much real business, and the market simply corrected itself the way markets do. Sir Isaac Newton, who lost roughly £20,000 in the crash, is remembered for saying he could calculate the motion of the heavens but not the madness of men. It is a tidy morality tale about mania, repeated in classrooms and best-selling books for 2 centuries. What that account leaves out is what the ledger in that locked room actually showed. Not madness, a mechanism, designed by named men, for named beneficiaries, structured to succeed for its architects no matter what happened to the stock afterward. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what the record shows, you have to start 9 years before the crash, with a debt problem the popular version of this story almost never mentions. By 1711, England had spent a decade fighting the War of the Spanish Succession, and the Treasury was carrying roughly £9 million of short-term government debt that nobody knew how to refinance. Interest rates on this debt were high, repayment was uncertain, and the paper itself traded at a steep discount because holders doubted the government would ever make good on it. Robert Harley, then Lord Treasurer, needed a way to convert that unstable debt into something the state could service at a lower, fixed rate. His solution was the South Sea Company, chartered in 1711. The company would absorb roughly £9 million of government debt from private holders, who would receive company stock in exchange. In return, the Treasury guaranteed the company an annual payment on that converted sum, and Parliament granted the company an exclusive trading monopoly with Spanish America, formalized 2 years later in the Treaty of Utrecht as the asiento, the right to supply enslaved Africans to Spain's colonies, and to send one annual trading ship into Spanish ports. Here is the detail the standard telling of this story almost never sits with. The asiento trade was never the business. Spain restricted the company's ship to a single voyage a year, taxed its cargo heavily, and by 1718, war with Spain had suspended the trade altogether. The company that would become synonymous with a financial mania of historic proportions had, at the peak of its stock price, shipped exactly 1 profitable cargo in its entire operating history. What the South Sea Company actually did, from its first year to its last, was manage government debt. The trading monopoly was never the engine. It was the cover story that made a debt management vehicle sound like an overseas trading empire to men who had never seen a bill of lading from Cartagena. The £9 million Harley folded into the 1711 charter was not one debt but several, held across the Navy, the Ordnance Office, and the Victualling Office in the form of unpaid bills issued to contractors and sailors who had supplied the war effort and simply never been paid in cash, trading on the street at discounts as steep as 30% of face value because holders had no confidence the Treasury would ever redeem them at par. Converting this patchwork of unsecured government IOUs into a single tradable company stock did something genuinely useful for the state's short-term solvency, and that is worth stating plainly, because the record here is not a record of pure villainy. The 1711 conversion worked reasonably well, restructured a real fiscal crisis, and bought the Treasury breathing room it badly needed. What changed by 1719 was scale and intent. The second conversion was not designed to solve a liquidity crisis. It was designed to generate a trading profit for the men engineering it, using the same debt-for-equity mechanism that had legitimately rescued the Treasury 8 years earlier. The company's governance, meanwhile, was built to project a majesty its ledgers did not earn. King George I accepted the largely ceremonial post of governor of the South Sea Company in 1718, lending the crown's name to a commercial enterprise in a way that blurred, deliberately, the line between state debt management and royal endorsement. Beneath him sat a sub-governor, Sir John Fellows, a deputy governor, and a court of some 30 directors drawn from the city's merchant and banking families, men like Sir Theodore Jansen and Elias Turner, most of whom held substantial personal stakes in the very conversion scheme they were voting to approve. John Blunt himself held no formal court title and little inherited wealth. He had trained as a scrivener, moved into the Swordblade Company's banking operations in the 1690s, and by 1719 had positioned himself as the scheme's chief architect without ever holding the company's top office, a pattern common to financial engineers of every era, in which the person who designs the mechanism is rarely the person whose name sits at the top of the letterhead, and rarely the person Parliament calls first when the mechanism fails. By 1719, the company's directors, led by a former linen draper turned financier named John Blunt, proposed something far larger than the original 1711 conversion. England's total national debt stood near £50 million, much of it held as irredeemable annuities paying between 6 and 9%, sold to fund earlier wars. Blunt's plan was to have the South Sea Company absorb the greater part of this debt in a single sweeping conversion, exchanging government annuities for company stock. The Bank of England, which had its own designs on managing the national debt, submitted a competing proposal, and for several months in late 1719 and early 1720, the two institutions engaged in an open bidding war in Parliament, each offering the Treasury better terms to win the right to the conversion. The bank's initial offer proposed absorbing the debt at an effective rate near 5%, and the South Sea Company countered by offering the Treasury a large lump payment on top of a lower service rate, a bid that only made arithmetic sense if the company could later sell shares to the public at prices well above the value implied by the underlying annuity income, meaning the entire conversion was priced, from its very first offer to Parliament, on the assumption that the stock would trade far above its fundamental worth. The South Sea Company ultimately won by offering the government £7.5 million up front, a sum it did not have and would need to raise through the very stock issuance the conversion was meant to enable. This is the structural fact that the Mania narrative erases. The debt conversion bill that passed Parliament in April of 1720 was not a response to public enthusiasm for South Sea stock. The enthusiasm came after, engineered specifically to make the conversion profitable for the men who had already committed the company to terms it could only meet if the share price kept climbing. To win that parliamentary vote, and to keep the price climbing once it had, the company's directors did not rely on trade rumors alone, although they used those too, seeding talk of silver mines in Mexico and rich new markets in Peru. They relied on a mechanism the secret committee later reconstructed from the company's own books, line by line. It was called fictitious stock. Company insiders allocated blocks of South Sea shares to members of Parliament, government ministers, and members of the royal court, without requiring any payment. The recipient's name was entered against the stock as though a purchase had occurred. When the share price rose, as the company's own directors were working to ensure it would, the recipient could sell the stock, pocket the difference between the fictitious purchase price and the market price, and never once have risked a shilling of their own money. Among the names the committee found in that ledger were John Aislabie, Chancellor of the Exchequer, who had steered the conversion bill through the Commons, and who received stock worth tens of thousands of pounds without payment. Charles Stanhope, Secretary of the Treasury, received similar allocations. James Craggs the Younger, Secretary of State, and his father, James Craggs the Elder, Postmaster General, both appear in the ledger with substantial fictitious holdings. The Duchess of Kendal and the Countess of Platten, two of King George I's closest companions at court, were allocated stock worth well over £100,000 between them, distributed in a way the committee's report described as designed to secure the passage of the bill. The secret committee reconstructed this system in 1721 from surviving subscription books, comparing the names entered against stock allocations with the Treasury's own record of who had actually transferred funds to the company. Where a name appeared against a block of shares with no corresponding payment recorded anywhere in the company's cash books, the committee marked it as fictitious. It was, in effect, an early forensic audit, conducted by men with no formal accounting training, working from ledgers the company's own officers had every incentive to have destroyed before Parliament ever asked to see them. This was not a company that got lucky with public sentiment. It was a company that purchased the votes needed to convert England's national debt into its own stock, using stock it had not yet sold, to a public that had not yet been told the trade monopoly underwriting the whole enterprise had barely moved a single ship in 2 years. Once the conversion bill passed in April of 1720, the company opened its stock to public subscription in a series of rounds, and this is where the mechanism moved from Parliament into the streets of London. The first subscription in April was offered at £300 a share. By late May, the price had passed £500. The company itself was the primary lender fueling this rise. Through the Swordblade Company, a former sword manufacturer that had reorganized itself as a private bank specifically to service South Sea transactions, the company extended loans to investors secured against their own South Sea shares, allowing buyers to purchase more stock than they could otherwise afford, using the rising value of that same stock as collateral for the loan that had bought it. The company ran 4 separate subscription rounds between April and August, at rising fixed prices of £300, £400, £1,000, and finally £1,000 again in August, each round oversubscribed within hours by buyers competing for allocations rather than negotiating price. a pattern that looks less like organic demand than a company deliberately rationing access to keep the appearance of scarcity intact while its own directors quietly diversified out of the position the public was still fighting to get into. The company was not merely selling shares, it was lending the money used to buy them, collecting interest on both ends, and recording every rise in share price as an increase in the collateral base supporting the next round of lending. By June, the price passed £1,000. Isaac Newton, who as master of the mint sat close enough to government finance to have every reason for caution, had already sold an early holding in April for a solid profit, then watched the price continue climbing and bought back in near the top, a decision that cost him the fortune his earlier trade had secured. He was far from alone. Contemporary accounts describe servants, clergymen, and minor gentry crowding Exchange Alley trying to buy in, convinced the price had nowhere to go but up, unaware that the men managing the company's books had already begun quietly selling their own holdings while publicly encouraging the rally to continue. Contemporary bank records, later examined by historians, show Blunt selling a substantial block of his personal holding in June, weeks before the August peak, while continuing to sit on the company's court of directors issuing public statements about the strength of the Peruvian trade prospects that were fueling the buying. Other directors followed the same pattern in smaller amounts through July. None of this required insider trading law to be illegal in 1720, because no such law existed yet. It required only that the men writing the company's public statements about its prospects were the same men positioned to know, before anyone else, exactly how thin those prospects actually were. The public response to all of this, once the climb was underway, was not blind faith so much as a kind of organized frenzy the company itself helped manufacture. Exchange Alley in the spring of 1720 spawned dozens of imitator ventures, popularly remembered afterward as bubble companies, offering shares in schemes for everything from a perpetual motion wheel to, in the words of one prospectus, a company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is, which reportedly raised £2,000 from subscribers in a single morning before its promoter vanished by afternoon. William Hogarth later engraved a print titled The South Sea Scheme, showing a carousel of gamblers, clergymen, and prostitutes riding a wooden horse toward ruin while fortune's wheel turns above them and a devil carves up a corpse labeled interest. Jonathan Swift wrote a poem on the subject that circulated through London that same autumn, comparing the company's directors to conjurers who had first raised the devil and then discovered they could not put him back down. None of that satire treated the collapse as an accident of collective psychology. It treated it, correctly, as a scheme with named architects who had gotten out before the trick they had built stopped working. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In June of 1720, at the height of the rise, the South Sea Company's directors lobbied Parliament for a law that has survived in English company law far longer than the company itself did. It became known as the Bubble Act, and the standard telling usually presents it as a government attempt to restrain speculative excess. The financial record shows something closer to the opposite. Dozens of new joint stock ventures had sprung up that spring, promising everything from insurance schemes to a company for, in the words of one contemporary pamphlet, carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. Capital that might otherwise have flowed into South Sea stock was being diverted into these rival schemes. The Bubble Act, pushed through by South Sea directors themselves, required royal charter for any joint stock company and effectively outlawed the competitors siphoning off investor capital. It was not a brake applied to the Mania. It was a mechanism built by the company at the center of the Mania to eliminate the competition threatening its own share price. And it worked, briefly. With rival schemes shut down, South Sea stock reached its peak near the end of June, trading above £1,050 a share, an increase of more than 700% from the January price, for a company whose actual overseas trade had generated almost no revenue in nearly a decade of operation. The collapse that followed in August and September of 1720 is usually narrated as a spontaneous panic, investors suddenly waking up to reality. The mechanism behind it was more specific than that. The entire structure depended on new money continuously entering the system to support the loans the Swordblade Company had extended against inflated collateral. When the Bubble Act began forcing the winding down of rival schemes that summer, some of that displaced capital did not flow back into South Sea stock. It simply left the market, and new subscriptions slowed. By late August, the Swordblade Company itself, overexposed to loans secured by a stock whose price it could no longer support, began running short of cash to meet withdrawals. On the 18th of September, the bank suspended payments. Word spread through the city within hours, and the collateral chain that had inflated the share price for 5 months reversed with the same mechanical speed. By the end of September, the stock had fallen to £150. By December, it traded near 124, almost exactly where it had started the year, except that in the intervening months, an enormous volume of borrowed money secured against inflated shares had been permanently destroyed, and thousands of investors who had bought late, on credit, against collateral that no longer existed, were left owing debts on stock, now worth a fraction of its purchase price. What happened next is the part of the record that the Mania narrative has the hardest time accommodating, because it shows a state moving with remarkable speed and precision to protect specific people rather than the public that had actually lost money. Parliament convened a secret committee of inquiry in 1721, and its investigators went looking for the company's books, only to find that key ledgers, including the record of fictitious stock allocations, had been altered or removed. Robert Knight, the company's cashier, who had personally managed the fictitious stock accounts, fled to the continent in the summer of 1721, taking with him the ledger the committee most needed, a volume that came to be known informally as the Green Book. He was traced to Tirlemont in the Austrian Netherlands and briefly detained, but escaped custody before he could be extradited back to England, and the Green Book was never fully recovered. Knight spent the following years moving between the Austrian Netherlands and Paris, never returning to England even after a general pardon was later extended to lesser figures in the scandal, a self-imposed exile that outlasted every politician the investigation had actually managed to punish. Several names the committee suspected had received fictitious stock, reportedly including figures close to the king himself, were never conclusively proven in the surviving record, because the specific document that would have proven them was, by the time Parliament went looking, already on a boat across the channel with the one man who could read it. That is the gap in this story worth naming directly. The record does not end because the trail went cold. It ends because the man carrying the evidence chose, or was helped, to disappear with it. Of the men whose fictitious stock was documented and survived the purge of the books, the consequences varied sharply by rank. John Aislabie was found guilty by the House of Commons of what the committee's report called the most notorious, dangerous, and infamous corruption, expelled from Parliament, and briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London, though he kept a substantial portion of his fortune and lived out his remaining decades on his Yorkshire estate. James Craggs the Elder took poison and died before the investigation reached him, a death contemporaries widely read as a confession no formal proceeding ever had to extract. James Craggs the Younger died of smallpox that same winter, before his own role could be fully examined in the Commons, a piece of timing several members of Parliament at the time noted with open suspicion rather than sympathy. Charles Stanhope was tried and, by a narrow margin of 3 votes, acquitted. The Duchess of Kendal and the Countess of Platten, the 2 women closest to the king, were never investigated by Parliament at all. Their fictitious stock allocations appear in the surviving fragments of company records, but no formal inquiry into the royal court's role was permitted to proceed, and the reason for that has a name too: Robert Walpole. Walpole had publicly opposed Blunt's conversion scheme when it was first proposed in 1719, calling it a scheme to enrich a few at the expense of the many, and he had been pointedly excluded from the company's inner circle of directors as a result. When the crash came, that earlier opposition made him the one senior political figure with clean enough hands to manage the crisis, without managing his own exposure at the same time. Appointed to lead the recovery effort in 1721, Walpole engineered what the financial record shows as a genuinely consequential piece of institutional engineering, absorbing a large portion of South Sea stock into the Bank of England and the East India Company at fixed, government-guaranteed terms, stabilizing the collateral chain and preventing a second collapse. Each institution took on roughly £9 million of South Sea stock under this arrangement, converting a single catastrophic default into several years of routine bond servicing, a resolution that shielded the financial system's other major institutions from the same collateral failure that had already ended the Swordblade Bank. At the same time, Walpole moved to limit how far the parliamentary investigation into the court's own role would be permitted to go, a set of political maneuvers his contemporaries and later historians referred to as the Screening Act, protecting the king and his closest circle from the same exposure Aislabie and Stanhope had faced. The rescue and the cover-up were not 2 separate stories. They were the same operation, run by the same man, and the political capital Walpole earned from both halves of it is what made him, within months, the dominant figure in British government for the next 2 decades, holding the office of First Lord of the Treasury from 1721 to 1742, a tenure long enough and consolidated enough that later historians would come to describe him, informally at first, and then as a matter of convention, as Britain's first Prime Minister. The office that still runs the British government today has its institutional roots, in no small part, in one man's management of a scandal he had refused to profit from and then chose, carefully, not to fully expose. The South Sea Company itself did not disappear in 1720, and this is the detail that most tellings of the story leave out entirely, because it complicates the tidy ending. Stripped of its trading pretensions, the company continued to exist as a vehicle for holding a portion of the national debt, quietly and without incident, for another 133 years. It kept the asiento in name for a few more years before formally surrendering the Spanish trading rights in 1750. It kept issuing annuity payments to the holders of its converted stock, the very people who had exchanged secure government paper for company shares in 1720 and never recovered their original value. The company was not formally dissolved until 1853, when the Deferred Annuities Act finally wound down its remaining obligations, more than a century after the crash that made its name a byword for financial folly. The institution that the popular story treats as a brief, spectacular collapse was, in the financial record, a debt management structure that quietly outlived nearly everyone involved in building it, including the men it had ruined. There is a parallel worth naming, because the same year produced a near-identical structure on the other side of the Channel, built by a different architect with the same institutional logic. In France, the Scottish financier John Law had, since 1716, been constructing his own state debt conversion vehicle, the Mississippi Company, granted a monopoly over French trade with Louisiana in exchange for absorbing French royal debt, with Law himself appointed Contrôleur Général des Finances, effectively running the French Treasury and the company simultaneously, a concentration of control the South Sea directors never achieved but clearly envied. Law's mechanism ran through his Banque Royale, which issued paper currency backed nominally by future Mississippi Company profits, and through the trading floor on the Rue Quincampoix in Paris, where crowds reportedly numbering in the tens of thousands gathered daily by the spring of 1720 to buy and sell Mississippi shares, a scene contemporary witnesses described as more chaotic than anything London's Exchange Alley produced. When the mechanism failed that same year, the French livre lost roughly 97% of its value within months, and Law fled France in December, disguised, according to some accounts, in his own coachman's clothes, never to return. The Mississippi Company's share price underwent an almost identical trajectory to South Sea stock, rising through speculative fervor over Louisiana's supposed mineral wealth and collapsing in the same year, 1720, for the same underlying reason, a debt-for-equity conversion whose stability depended entirely on the share price continuing to rise indefinitely. London and Paris, in other words, ran the same experiment simultaneously, using the same mechanism, dressed in different trading monopolies, and both produced the same result within months of each other. That is not a coincidence historians have struggled to explain. It is a design flaw common to both structures, visible the moment you set the two ledgers beside each other, instead of treating each collapse as a nationally isolated event. The system built into both conversions, the South Sea scheme in particular, was never neutral between the parties involved, and this is where the standard account's framing as a shared public folly breaks down completely under the financial record. The annuity holders who converted government paper into company stock in 1720 gave up a fixed, government-backed payment stream for an asset whose value depended entirely on continued speculative demand the company's own directors were manufacturing. If the price held, the company and its insiders profited from the fees, interest, and fictitious stock built into the structure. If the price collapsed, as it did, the loss fell overwhelmingly on the converting annuitants and the later round subscribers who had bought in on swordblade credit, while the architects who had sold early, in Blunt's case reportedly liquidating a substantial portion of his own holdings in the weeks before the August peak, kept their gains. The design guaranteed a specific outcome for a specific party regardless of which direction the stock ultimately moved, because the men managing the mechanism could exit on either side of that movement, and the annuity holders who had converted their government paper could not. The human scale of that asymmetry is visible in individual cases the committee's report did not track, but contemporaries did. The Duke of Chandos, one of the era's wealthiest patrons, is estimated to have lost roughly £300,000 in the collapse, a sum that forced him to scale back construction on his own estate for years afterward. The poet John Gay was given stock worth several £1,000s by a friend at the height of the rise, and against the advice of Alexander Pope, refused to sell while the price was still climbing, converting what could have been a comfortable independent income into nothing at all by September. Pope himself lost a smaller sum and wrote afterward that he had learned more about human nature from the South Sea Company than from all his reading of philosophy combined. The long consequence of this mechanism reaches further than the 18th century. The Bubble Act, passed to protect South Sea stock from competing schemes, remained on the statute books restricting the formation of joint stock companies in Britain until it was finally repealed in 1825. shaping more than a century of British corporate law around a measure originally designed as a competitive weapon rather than a consumer protection. Its repeal was followed swiftly by the Joint Stock Companies Act of 1844, the first British statute requiring companies to register and disclose basic financial information to the public, a regulatory lineage that traces in a fairly direct line back to the very structure the Bubble Act had originally been built to protect, rather than to prevent. The office Walpole consolidated while managing the cover-up became the template for the modern British Premiership, an institutional lineage traceable directly back to 1721. And the underlying mechanism itself, a state converting unstable debt into equity in a vehicle controlled by insiders who profit regardless of the outcome, did not vanish with the South Sea Company's slow wind-down in 1853. It reappeared, in modified form, in nearly every major financial crisis since, wherever a government debt problem and a privately controlled conversion vehicle have been allowed to share the same architects. The ledger the secret committee opened in that locked room in Westminster in December of 1721 did not describe a nation briefly losing its senses. It described a mechanism, and mechanisms, once built, tend to outlast the men who profited from designing them, surviving in statute, in institutional habit, and occasionally in the very shell companies left standing once the crowd that made them famous has gone home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.